All right, class. Today we kind of wrap up our look at the Renaissance period. And as we've seen kind of this cultural and intellectual revolution in the Renaissance, we're also going to see a major religious revolution brought about by this new Renaissance intellect as well. And that comes in the form of the Protestant Reformation. And so, much like we saw in the Renaissance period a rise in humanist thought, when it comes to religious matters, we're going to see a rise in what is known as Christian humanism. And so, the Protestant Reformation begins in the northern parts of Europe, particularly in Germany, which we'll talk more about here shortly. And Christian humanism comes about as this idea to reform the Catholic Church. And there is kind of this emphasis and belief in human ability to reason and understand and basically decide for oneself. And so there becomes an emphasis to study early Christian writings, the fundamental teachings of Christianity contained in the Bible. And so there's this emphasis for individuals to be more dedicated to a personal study and reading of the Bible. And so it's believed that through studying the Bible themselves, they will develop a more interreligious sincerity, that they will have better religious knowledge, that they will know, what they believe and don't believe. And so these were aspects that were kind of valuable to reform as many began to read, study the Bible, and see areas of contrast to some of the teachings of the Catholic Church. And so this kind of is some of the basis for the Reformation. And one of the early Christian humanists that's the most well-known is Erasmus. And Erasmus had several kind of tenets that he supported that were kind of foundational pieces for the most commonly known individual from the Reformation period in Martin Luther. And so Erasmus pitched a few different ideas, one of which was that Christianity should shape the lives daily of the individuals. And so early on there was an emphasis for many during the Renaissance period trying to find assurance of their salvation. They wanted to save their soul. They heard about heaven and hell. They did not want to go to hell. They wanted to save their soul. And so it was common for many to basically kind of try to see, what was the basic thing they could do to save their soul for salvation. And Erasmus calls for more of a commitment that Christianity should shape the daily lives of individuals and not just be, something that people turn to just as a hope to save their soul. Similarly, he calls for a return to the simpler days of Christianity and kind of goes against some of the common teachings in the Catholic Church. And so during this time we've mentioned before, in things like the Canterbury Tales, these religious pilgrimages where people were going to tombs of the church leaders and believed tombs of the saints and things as a religious journey. And he sees these things as essentially, they're unimportant. They're not important to one's faith. They're not important to one's salvation. And similarly, the collection of relics, which became popular partially through the Crusades, collecting Christian relics, he says these things are not important. We should focus on what is important to Christianity. And in his work, The Praise of the Folly, he kind of tongue-in-cheek, humorously kind of criticizes the state of society during that time, the actions of the Catholic leaders, and calls for a more simple, basic, and pure faith. So during the Renaissance period, the kind of call for reform originated out of many who were upset with some of the Catholic Church popes who seemed to be a little more concerned with political power, career gain, or wealth gain, rather than the spiritual needs of the people. And so, once again, as many were individuals were wanting to know more about salvation, many Catholic Church practices seem to be more focused on control and wealth. And this was particularly seen in what was known as indulgences. And indulgences were documents that the church actually sold, where the Pope would sign off, or a church leader would sign off, saying that the person holding the document was released from punishment, some form of punishment for their sin. And this would often refer to time in purgatory, which the Catholic Church often emphasized, and basically stated that the individual had been forgiven for this sin and did not have to be punished in purgatory for this. And this was kind of a repeatable thing, and so people had to keep buying these or collect more relics and things like that. And so relics were a way to achieve these indulgences. But also indulgences began to be sold to people. People could buy their way into an indulgence, so believedly buy their way out of sin. And these indulgences were also offered as a way to help loved ones who perhaps were in purgatory to escape purgatory. And so it was a major source of corruption and financial gain for many Catholic Church leaders. And so it was an early sign of the need for reform. Now, the Catholic Church also, in its practices teaching on salvation, emphasized faith and works. And the Protestant side, which we'll get to in a moment with Martin Luther, will emphasize particularly salvation by faith alone. Similarly, another idea, a mystical movement known as modern devotion, said that it was more important to simply follow Jesus' teachings and be a good person to achieve salvation. And so we have many different kind of explanations for salvation during this time. Nonetheless, the major move for reform in the Protestant Reformation is headed up by none other than Martin Luther, who was a German monk and a Bible professor at a university in Germany. He studied the Bible extensively, and in doing so, his understanding of the Bible led him to believe that the basis for the certainty of salvation was by faith alone. It was not in works as the Catholic Church taught. It was not through buying indulgences or obtaining relics or anything like that. It was simply faith in Jesus. And so this contrasted the Catholic teaching here. Similarly, he said it should not be the church or the Pope that one goes to for truth, but one must find that truth themselves by reading the one real truth in the Bible. And so the Bible was the source of truth. And so it contrasted some Catholic teaching in this way. And Martin Luther made his beliefs and his criticisms of the church well known in his 95 Theses. And in this kind of public declaration, which the story is often told that he nailed the thesis to the castle church doors, it was a common practice to put proclamations or news of the day on the church doors. And so he makes this his beliefs public. He lists the abuses of the Catholic Church, really goes into detail about the corruption of selling indulgences, particularly an individual named Johann Tetzel, who famously gave the statement, "Every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs," in an effort to take advantage of people and get them to pay money to supposedly free their loved ones from purgatory. And so he criticizes this corruption and sees these actions as a way of soothing the conscience, to just make people feel better about their spiritual situation rather than being more devoted. And so his ideas are printed, and through the Gutenberg printing press, thousands of copies are then made available. So with his ideas, there are many kind of new reforms are introduced. Once again, new doctrine of salvation by faith alone. He also says that clergy should be allowed to marry. Catholic priests were told to be celibate, and he said there was no reason that clergy could not marry, that the Bible often supported and encouraged marriage for most people. He also wants to do away with all but 2 of the sacraments in baptism and communion, which he sees as very valuable. He also calls for German princes to overthrow corrupt papal leaders and to introduce this new Reformed church and getting back to the basics in a purer faith. And so for his actions and beliefs, he is excommunicated by the Pope in 1521. He will eventually be brought to trial by the new Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who believes that he can make Luther kind of apologize for his actions and kind of backtrack on what he stated, and by kind of putting pressure on him and threatening him. Nonetheless, Luther actually doubles down on his beliefs and refuses to back down. And so through the Edict of Worms, Luther is introduced as an outlaw to the empire and has to go into hiding for a period of time because of his new beliefs. Nonetheless, his beliefs give rise to the Protestant movement and the movement of Lutheranism, which becomes the very first Protestant denomination. And Lutheranism begins to gain support by many German rulers who kind of side with Luther, who see this as a new opportunity as well. And Lutheranism really transforms the ideas of salvation. It introduces a new religious service style that goes kind of contrast with the Catholic Mass, in that there is Bible reading, worship, singing, and the preaching of a message, which is what you might see commonly in a Protestant church today, even in America. And so this kind of change occurs, as well as he marries a former nun, and the two kind of provide an example of a model family for ministers. As Lutheranism and the Protestant movement kind of gain traction, war will break out between Catholics and Protestant groups, and many peasants wanting to become Protestants or to break out of their restrictions lead what was known as the Peasants' War in 1524, and they expect Luther to really back them. But he sees this as more politically motivated, and he says no, instead Christians were to be called by God to try to maintain peace as much as possible, and that would enable the promotion of the gospel message, the good news of the church. And so as Protestantism catches on in different state authorities throughout Germany, it will begin to spread. And so similar to Italy, we do not have a monarchical state here in Germany, but rather than city-states, we have more territorial states, which will kind of catch on with Protestantism. And so as wars continue between the Protestant church and the Catholic church, there is perceived a great threat from the Catholic leaders and Charles V that this could upend kind of the political and social order as well as the religious. And so he tries to organize a force to suppress and eliminate Protestantism, but by the time he's able to do so, it has grown too large. And so he's forced to move towards some sort of peace agreement. That peace agreement comes in the form of the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which will put an end to the religious warfare, and is a major step in that it officially recognizes a division in Christianity, that we now have a Catholic group and a Protestant group, which at the time is Lutheran group. And so this kind of recognizes the new divide in the Christian denomination. And this allows states to now choose between Catholicism or Lutheranism. Peasants still have to follow the religion of their state, and so if you wanted to be a Protestant, you need to be in a Protestant state, a Catholic state. But nonetheless, kind of an early recognition here of the division. So when it comes to the Reformation, it spreads far beyond just Germany. and one of the areas that it will impact is Switzerland. And so as this division is accepted in Europe, there continues to be more religious reforms. Some of these are more devout or strict or extreme. And so one of those we see in Switzerland, in the Council of Zurich and priest Ulrich Zwingli, we see more extensive moves away from Catholicism. So here they remove all paintings and decorations from churches, seeing them, these icons, as a form of idolatry. And so the veneration of the saints, which was common in Catholic churches, certainly not accepted here. Similarly, there is a similar church style to the early Lutheran and Protestant movement, but more of an emphasis on prayer. And so ultimately, through the wars, Zwingli would be captured and killed in battle, very brutally, dismembered and burned. And this would lead the torch of Protestantism in Switzerland to be passed to John Calvin. And John Calvin was important because he starts kind of a new Protestant movement known as Calvinism. So whereas he has many similar views to Martin Luther, and certainly holds the view of justification by faith, he also introduces a new belief of predestination. And so Calvinism emphasizes this idea of predestination, whereby God had already divinely selected those whom he wished to be saved, and those who were condemned to death. And so it was believed he had already determined those that would be saved and those that would be punished. And so this kind of spurs an idea that the Calvinist movement of the Christian church was tasked with making sure that they spread the faith to all those that God had designed or chosen to be saved. And so it was important that they carry out this role. And so they helped to establish many missionary groups that would spread Calvinism throughout Europe. Meanwhile, in England, we have a rise of Reformation as well. But rather than a religious Reformation, we have more of a religious movement brought about through political means. And so here King Henry VIII, who had many wives for political power and alignment reasons, and also in search of a male heir, had some 6 wives, but he wanted to divorce his first wife because she was unable to give him a male heir. They bore several children, many of whom died in infancy, most of whom were all female, and ultimately only Mary the First, their daughter, would survive. And so he wished to marry another woman to have a male heir. However, the Pope was unwilling to annul the marriage because they had consummated the marriage, and which broke the guidelines for an annulment. And so the Pope refused to recognize this annulment. So King Henry turned to the High Church Court in Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who you would think similar to like the Supreme Court, and he declares the marriage null and void. And so Henry is able to marry Anne Boleyn, who will be made queen, and they have a daughter who eventually would become, who would be Elizabeth the First. And in marrying his new wife, he kind of disowns his other wife and his first daughter in Mary as an illegitimate child. Now, King Henry, seeking his way, if you will, in this matter, breaks with the Pope and the Catholic Church and persuades Parliament to recognize this by 1534. And so the Act of Supremacy is a major proclamation in that it establishes this new Church of England, which is also referred to as the Anglican Church. And at the head of this Anglican Church is the king, who is both the government or political ruler and also the kind of church leader, the head of the Church of England. So he has total control of the doctrinal teaching, total control of who is in clergy positions, total control of discipline. And he's very ruthless in this matter, as he had many who opposed him beheaded or burned at the stake. So he made major efforts to consolidate the kingdom into the Anglican Church, did away with many monasteries, and sold off the land to those that would follow him. And so kind of consolidated his power in this way. Ultimately, his third wife would give him a son, and after King Henry's death in 1547, his 9-year-old son Edward VI would succeed him, and he continued to move the Church of England towards a more Protestant belief, a very devout Protestantism. Nonetheless, he dies at the young age of 12 due to tuberculosis, and being the only male heir, this then leaves Henry's oldest daughter to come to the throne in 1553. And so Mary I will come to power, and she, unlike Henry and his son, who were Protestants, is a devout Catholic. And so she went about heavily persecuting Protestants, perhaps partially out of her disdain for her father and those that allowed the dissolution of the marriage of her mother and King Henry. She persecutes and has nearly 300 Protestants burned as heretics. And so this is where we get the kind of moniker Bloody Mary, is because of her persecution of Protestants. Nonetheless, despite the persecution, Protestantism actually grows and thrives, and people become more committed to the Protestant movement. This would give rise to many changes and even more kind of groups of the faith. One of those groups were the Anabaptists, and the Anabaptists were seen as more of kind of an extreme or radical group, and so they were often very heavily persecuted, many of them having to head off to Munster, Germany, as a sanctuary city to be protected from persecution from both Protestants and Catholics. And the Anabaptists were unique in that they recognized the Christian church as a voluntary community. One chose to be a Christian. They chose to have faith, and that made them a Christian. They were not just deemed one as a child. And so they practiced adult baptism. When one chose to believe and went amongst this spiritual rebirth and would live the Christian life, they were baptized as a symbol of their new faith and new life. Whereas Catholics had often baptized infants, declaring them Catholic at birth. Similarly, similar practices to many early Christian ideas, but there is a couple unique ideas that kind of define them as more radical groups, in that they considered everyone a priest, everyone could be a minister, you didn't have to be an upper, well-educated person of society. They also believed that everyone, should witness, and they also recognized government roles, public office, as a corrupt occupation, and so they refused to hold any public office, and they held strict to the right to bear arms, or to the idea that one should not kill, and so they would not carry weapons or fight, believing that it was wrong to kill no matter the cost. And so this was kind of an extreme position, and they suffered much persecution because of it. But things such as adult baptism and a voluntary commitment to the faith would carry on in the Protestant tradition. So the Protestant Reformation led to many changes in society, an emphasis on now Protestant Christian schools and universities. So similar to the humanist schools, we now have these Protestant schools. This was largely spurred by the idea that Luther had that all children should have a Christian education provided by the state, that it was just as vital as learning things like mathematics or philosophy, that people should be taught Christian values, morals, and principles, and this would create more well-rounded individuals. And this was open to all individuals. So whereas humanist schools were basically just for the nobility, the uppers of society, these Protestant Christian schools were available to everyone. Similarly, The Protestant movement modified the view of marriage in that it allowed clergymen to be married and have a family, and encouraged them to have a family. It also praised the idea of mutual love in marriage, not arranged marriages for political reasons, but actual two loving a man and woman. And also, husbands and wives' roles were recognized as a part of God's divine plan. And so it was seen as a good thing for a husband and a wife to have unique roles in the family, and that by doing so, they each kind of did their part, and it bettered the family unit as a whole. And this was part of God's great plan. It was nothing to be looked down upon, but it was part of God's divine plan. And so in response to the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church would have to go about some reform as well. And so a new Catholic revitalization in the mid-16th century led to a new group known as the Jesuits. And this religious order took a more strict obedience to the Pope and really emphasized education to spread their message. And so many Jesuit schools were created as well. Pope Paul III embraced the reform and gained support. He appointed a reform commission to help identify necessary changes and issues in the church. And so they recognized the corrupt policies of the past. They recognized the corruption involved in many of the selling of indulgences. And so they kind of admit to the wrongdoings in an effort to kind of create more or reestablish more faith in the Catholic Church. The Council of Trent in 1545, a group that met for nearly 18 years, kind of dealing with modern issues, aimed to kind of reestablish faith in the Catholic Church by doing away with the selling of indulgences, and by also kind of reaffirming a commitment to Catholic beliefs and teaching. So they don't change what they believe to kind of fit the Protestant mold or anything. They stick to their guns on both faith and good works for salvation, the sacraments, priest celibacy, the idea of purgatory, and other forms of indulgences. But nonetheless, this creates a clear body of doctrine for the Catholic Church. And so now we have a very distinct Catholic tradition and Protestant tradition. And so these two major branches of Christianity, which will continue to be very influential forces going forward into the remainder of world history. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on the Protestant Reformation and look forward to our next time together. Thank you.